Hi everyone, thanks for joining today's seminar series organized by the Empathic Computing Laboratory. I'm your host, Pai. Now, guest speaker for today is Andreas Duenser, who is a senior research scientist at isCSIRO, Australia. His main interest is in the convergence of psychology and emerging technology to develop a deeper understanding of human behavior. So his talk today will be about how human trust and cognitive load will affect health, safety, and efficiency in critical task environments. The talk will be roughly an hour, and then later on we can have a brief Q&A session. And also for your information, this talk will be recorded and will be uploaded in the future, probably on our lab website. So just keep an eye on that, in case you'll let your friends know about the talk. So without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, Andreas Duenser.
Thanks, Mike. As I said, sort of the talk in the broadest sense is about automation, trust, and workload, with a special focus on, I guess, on trust, and we'll see why that is. As I'm coming from the human factors side of things, so my background in psychology, I just have sort of this as the broad topic umbrella, like human factors in automation, with a focus on trust and workload. I'll probably start with a quick background of, I guess, not everybody may know what the isCSIRO is. So the isCSIRO is Australia's national science agency. So overall, I don't know the exact numbers at the moment, so we're around sort of between 5,000 and 6,000 people all over Australia, with different business units. Spanning from agriculture and foods to health and biosecurity, to land and water, ocean atmospheres, and also Data 61. That's the one business unit I'm in, and also we're spread all around Australia. So I'm located in Tasmania, Hobart. So it's sort of similar latitude. I just checked yesterday actually to sort of a little bit further up than Christchurch in terms of latitude, just to give you sort of an idea where we sit. What we do, I guess, so it's more sort of science technology for the benefit of environment, community, economy. And a lot of the stuff we do is more impact-driven research. So it's very, very much applied research. As we sort of, a national science agency, we do sort of, I think everything we do is sort of with the view of impact for Australia and I guess an extension to the looking at bigger impact-driven research. So Data 61 is one of the business units, as I said, within isCSIRO, the one I'm sitting in. And as the name says, it's sort of looking at different aspects of research and development in data science. So that encapsulates, for example, data capture, consumption, infrastructure, hardware, software, cybersecurity, decision sciences, and also behavioral economics and cognitive science. And I'm, I guess, especially, well, our group is in analytics decision sciences, and as the name says, so that's where we focus a lot of our research in. So the group, if we go down, the group within Data 61 I'm working in, we call it Knowledge Discovery and Management, and our focus is especially sort of in social technical systems. So not just technology development in itself, but technology development as part of a broader social technical system. And with that, we look at sort of, as I said, human factors and social aspects of this human system ecosystem, or human technology ecosystem. So how do we do that? What do we do? And the broadest sense, we sort of look at analyzing human behavior and cognitive processes, and that's sort of especially what I, with a background in psychology, am very interested in, especially that sort of behavior and cognitive processes as human interact with technology. Analyzing and producing insights from information, and that information can come from mainly from humans, but also other types of information, but mostly information generated by humans. Supporting decision makers. This is what I guess as decision scientists that what we do, and looking at how to provide appropriate information to users, and how to do this in a way that they really sort of can digest that information properly. Just bit of an overview of the capability that we have and the backgrounds that we have in our group. So psychology, human factors, that's where I'm coming from. As I said, language and language technologies, including natural language processing, information retrieval. We have people looking at more social network analysis. And I'm going to show some examples where we also now try to bring all different aspects of these capabilities together in sort of bigger projects as well. We also have people looking more at behavioral economics, or we also have statisticians looking at risk and risk assessment, and also how. And we're also quite interested in how to communicate risks to people. We're going to talk about that a bit later, potentially, as well. So some of the bigger challenges or scientific challenges that we look into is that how can we improve the uptake of technology solutions? So, for example, automation technologies, and now increasingly machine learning and AI-based systems, which automation technologies are one example of mostly. And this is why sort of the talk today sort of focused on these automation technologies, and an extension more the broader realm of machine learning-based decision support systems. Again, how do we communicate outputs from such systems, and especially how to do this in a way that decision makers can trust and rely on the system output. And having a closer look at what elements influence users' trust and acceptance of those systems. And I want to talk about aspects of calibrating trust to system performance, because that's one very important aspect that we look into. So, it's unpack sort of the issue of trust and see how we actually, as I said, sort of can calibrate the proper amount of trust put into the system based on the system's performance. And as I said, sort of part of what we do, and we want to create impact, impactful research. So the impact in that case would be improved uptake and better interaction with those technologies, and eventually uptake of those technologies by the broader community. Was it a question? Probably not. One of the main, I guess, areas, or just as I said, sort of topics I want to talk about today is sort of that idea: how does automation, trust, and cognitive load? How do these elements come together, and how do these, looking at sort of all these elements together, what can we sort of learn from that interaction between these aspects? A lot of that work started, well, we started some work that sort of a longer time ago, and then we did a lot of that work as part of a bigger collaborative research project. So I'm just not going to bore you about sort of the details, but these are bigger projects that Data61 can undertake with partners and partner universities, especially. So we had a big one of these collaborative research projects with partners at the University of Tasmania and also the University of South Australia, where sort of Mark, with his affiliation with the University of South Australia, was part of that COP, and we did some work with Mark as well, which I'm going to talk about today as well. And so the idea there was to look at automation in a broader sense, and especially human-operated systems, so not something that's fully automated, and also, well, thinking about it, so I personally don't like the term human-in-the-loop systems, because that sort of takes the human as an afterthought. So I'm actually defining them as human-operated systems, where the automation assists the user to achieve a task. So you can think about them semi-automated system or other kinds of system, I guess in extension that allow people to solve tasks such as, for example, as well, decision support systems. And there's a long, I guess, history, especially coming from human factors, where you look at, how does automation affect cognitive load in human operators, with the idea being, if you assist the user through automation to perform a task, that this assistance helps a person or operator to reduce their cognitive load while for solving that task. Cognitive load being the general, I guess you could say, demand that a task puts on the working memory. And working memory, even in a person, is a limited resource. So what you want to do, you don't want to overload a person with too much information, for example, or too many decisions to be made. But the idea being that automation helps the person to reduce some of that cognitive load. But then we also realize that this is not the full story, because there's another important element coming into that consideration as well, which is for one of these. There's many, obviously, but one that we became interested in is the element of trust, and trust being an essential precursor to system adoption and use. So why is it important, if we talk about sort of automation and workload, to take trust into consideration as well? And I think I just tried to visualize it in a little bit of a figure here. So the idea, as I said, you introduce automation to ideally reduce operator cognitive load, but that only works if a person trusts that system. Just imagine just an example, or just think about it that way. If you don't trust the system to perform reliably or properly, if you don't trust, then you won't use the full capacity of that automated system. So if you don't trust the automation, that would mean the automation doesn't help you to reduce cognitive load, because you will always sort of be vigilant to and actually don't benefit from the automation at all, or just only a little bit, because you don't trust the system. So what we try to do here, just to find how do these elements into play. So we then had a little bit more deep dive into this idea of looking at trust in an automated settings, trust in automation, and just for, I guess, completeness sake, I'm just going to show here one of the, I guess, many definitions of trust, especially with automated systems. And one of the most commonly used ones is the one by Lee and C, which sees trust as the attitude that an agent will help achieve an individual's goal in a situation that's characterized by uncertainty and vulnerability. So here, the vulnerability can be seen in many different ways, but as you can imagine, if I put trust into a system, I make myself vulnerable to some extent to that system. So I trust that system to support me in doing something. That's similar also, I guess, to interpersonal trust, where you make yourself vulnerable. By trusting another person, you make yourself vulnerable to some extent to that other person. And some important aspects here to pick out is sort of the idea of uncertainty, or also complexity. So what trust can do to you, I sort of like to see trust as some sort of heuristic. So if you can't deal or understand some sort of a situation due to its uncertainty or complexity, trust helps you to actually deal with that to some extent, because you trust the system to help you overcome that uncertainty and that complexity, and essentially or eventually help you in supporting in your decision making. And as I said earlier, what you also find in the literature, and which makes sense to some extent, that trust is a significant precursor to system uptake, and a general is significant to the willingness for a person to rely on a system. And this comes back to, if you don't trust the system, if you're not willing to trust the system, you don't rely on the system. And this comes back to it. You can't take advantage, for example, automation, a system support system, to help you reduce your cognitive load during operation. And it also, another aspect I probably have mentioned already is this idea of trust calibration. That's it's important to not over trust or under trust. So over trust would be, imagine a situation, and you probably have seen even news articles where people sit in their semi-autonomous cars or sort of autonomous cars and let go of the steering wheel and not back and say like, well, and just completely trust the system to do what it does. But as we may know, those systems are not that reliable yet. So overtrust in such circumstances can actually lead to quite fatal outcomes at times. Undertrust on the other end is not ideal either, because as we sort of mentioned earlier, if you don't trust the system at all, whereas it actually can perform to some extent reliably, but if you still don't trust it, so you don't take advantage of the system at all as well. So that ideal calibration of trust towards the system performance eventually could maximize, as we say, the performance and safety of the human, the general sort of that automation human system. So I'll just going to take you, I guess, through some of the work that we've done over the years and leading, I guess, towards where we are at the moment. So a while ago, we started looking more generally in the idea of cognitive load and how to measure cognitive load in different ways. So as psychologists, you're always interested in measuring what's going on with people, and so in that sense, what we can measure human behavior, cognitive processes in that case as well, or we also became interested in using psychophysiology as a proxy for measuring what's going on, or just for these cognitive processes in humans. So we ran a series of studies for measuring cognitive load, and this is not, well, this has been done over the years as well, so we're not the first ones having done that. So we started exploring EEG and different kinds of physiological measures. Yeah, as I said, EEG, pupillometry, galvanic skin response. As you can imagine, as also been shown before, each of these measures individually has different pros and cons. So, for example, with EEG, you can have sort of direct measurements of I guess brain cortical innervation, but it's very cumbersome to set up, and there's susceptible to artifacts, like movement artifacts, and so on. Then we, for example, look at pupillometry, which measures the dilation of the pupil, which can give you some nice insights as well into sort of the activation of the nervous system. But again, has sort of different also challenges because it's for example, the pupil not only dilates or fluctuates. The pupil dilation not only fluctuates based on the cognitive processes, but there is actually bigger fluctuations based on ambient and direct lighting coming into the eye as well. So what we found there early on is that multimodal cognitive load measurement is quite useful because it helps you overcome each sort of, by combining different measurements, helps you overcome deficiencies or problems with each individual one. So, and some papers, for example, looked at combining EEG and pupillometry, and what we could find that obviously by combining these two different measures, we could quite nicely improve on measuring cognitive load here. So this is sort of the idea of combining these different measures into multimodal measurements to improve accuracy. The problem obviously is, as I said, so EEG in the first instance is already quite cumbersome to deploy. Then if you then combine this with even other physiological measures, and you sort of instrument a person completely with different physiological measurements or sensors, which doesn't make it quite practical. And as I said, working with the CSIRO, we sort of do something more applied. So we try to look into something that's a little bit more easier to deploy or to use. So we then started to look into what we call lightweight measurements, lightweight physiological measurements. And there we mainly focused on galvanic skin response, or electrodermal activity. So this sensor measures the conductivity of your skin, and if you get sort of more excited, your nervous system gets more excited. You start sweating, even if you don't feel it sort of directly, and so this then shows in a change of the conductivity of your skin, and you can measure this through two sensors positioned at or somewhere on your skin. Usually it's put on your fingers, but we also played around with different sensor placements here. And again, you know, it's like all these measures have different pros and cons, but for us, the main reason why we looked into this is how can we actually overcome some of the potential problems with this measurement, with the view on making it more practical to deploy in the end somewhere. So we did a series of studies there as well, starting with some game-based type of setups, like here. I don't know if you can see this properly. So here the task that we gave participants to do was a sort of like an air traffic control oversee task of drones. So you had sort of different, you know, these drones flying all over the place, and your task was to avoid collision and refueling them. And so we manipulated the amount of objects within that task, which I guess then changed the difficulty, which was done to conditions with different demands on your cognitive load. And then at the same time, we measured the skin response, and the idea then was to see, can we how well can we distinguish between those difficulty levels based on signal coming out of that sensor. And at the same time, we also did sort of with an idea of validating the measure as a cognitive load measure. We also used this what's called the detection response task, DRT, which is an ISO standard for measuring cognitive load. So you see here the picture of that small sensor on the finger. And so there's different ways of responding to the task, but the idea is there, you feel so intermittently a buzzer, and then you have to press, you have to respond to that stimulus, and the more accurately and quickly you respond, the other way around actually, sort of the longer you take, the more inaccurate response is to that task, the higher your cognitive load. So this is a way for us to that we use as a means to try to validate that measure as well. Just I guess some general results here on that won't go into too much detail. I can share the papers with you if you're interested in those. So what we found, so we looked at different ways of looking at this GSR signal. So what we found, for example, if you look at the time domain, sort of more just easy just doing standardizing the signal and looking at sort of the overall amount of, in here, sort of the measure would be the microsiemens. What we found is that in the time domain, we find this sort of inverse U-shaped, or U-shape in that case, which is in the literature a typical for stress performance curve. And so what we sort of tentatively could sort of learn from that is that if you look at this time domain of that signal, the GSR response could actually be more telling you about the stress levels of a person. Whereas when you look at the frequency domain, so you transform the signal to the frequency domain through Fourier transforms, and then if you look at different aspects like mean peak frequency, or the total power of that transformed signal in the frequency domain, you actually see more a linear response rather than the inverse U-shaped response. So here we actually see as the total power, for example, decreases, the total power actually decreases linearly with the number of targets. So so you see as the task gets more difficult, the overall power in the frequency domain changes. So what we tentatively can learn from this, that potentially that if you look at the signal in the time domain, it may be a measure of stress, whereas you look at the measure in the frequency domain, it may be a measure of load, of cognitive load. And we also did some classification of the results, and we found that in that case that we could sort of predict, based on the frequency domain metrics, could predict cognitive load to a low to medium accuracy. We then moved to, rather than doing a simulated task on the computer, let people fly a small toy quadcopter. So this diamond shape is actually the shape they had to fly the quadcopter in. We manipulated their response curves of the quadcopter, so either sort of a direct interaction with the quadcopter, or a more smoothed operation by the quadcopter, which we sort of took as the level of sort of different levels of automation that you can take advantage of. So the more smooth response was supposed to create a less load on the operator, and at the same time we gave different instructions to the participants in that case. So to one part of the participants, we told them that this is a very trustworthy system, and the other part of the participants we told, well, this is an untrustworthy system. And then we also measured using GSR and other methods. We measured cognitive load and trust as well. And what we found here, that's paper pencil tests, for example. So you may have come across the NASA TLX as a measure, as a sort of widely used measure for cognitive load. We also used the system trust scale to measure trust, which is a sort of questionnaire to measure trust. So what we didn't find any differences in those questionnaires between the different load conditions and the different trust conditions. But when we looked at the GSR signal, we actually did find that the variations that we could pick up through the GSR signal were actually linked to high and low trust states, and we could predict that in that case sort of around the 80% accuracy mark. So the idea there was just again to explore, can we actually measure trust using physiology, and that was sort of a promising result that we found here. And I guess also the idea one of the results being that in some instances maybe direct physiological measurement could potentially be more sensitive than asking the person. So it could be more sensitive than subjective measures of trust and or workload. Some other work we did in that realm was with the Maritime College. So the Maritime College is a part of the University of Tasmania here, and they have a big ship simulator up in Launceston. And we did some work with them on, I guess, different aspects. So one thing they were interested in, does introducing new technology in such a environment, how does that affect cognitive load? So just to give you sort of a quick idea how that works. So this simulator is mainly used by commercial ship crews to train voyages in and out of ports, because this is the most dangerous maneuver. So a big ship moving in and out of ports. And what happens there, if you move a commercial ship in and out of port, usually what happens, a pilot from that specific port comes on board, and the pilot then takes or helps the crew on that ship voyage in and out of port. And so those pilots, they use what's called a portable pilot unit, a PPU. And the idea was, does a new kind of a new improved portable pilot unit. How does that affect cognitive load on such a port operation? And they're also interested in not just does it change cognitive load on just on the pilot side, but does it affect cognitive load for the whole team? So we instrumented different people of parties of that ship team. So there was the pilot, the tugboat operator, and I can't remember who else. I think it was the captain. So we instrumented them with small GSR sensors, and then try to see if we actually can find changes in GSR signal among them all. And so we found some sort of initial evidence for that, where we actually could see. So they obviously trained for unforeseen circumstances, so like rudder failure or bad weather. And so we actually could see when there was sort of some different problematic incidences coming up, we sort of saw concurrent changes in the signal with all these different parties. Then we also started to look into trust. It's still ongoing work. So how can we look into team trust in those distributed system teams as well? And also aspects of swift trust, which is, how do these teams, as as the pilot comes on board, quickly build trust amongst with these new air parties coming on board. Some other application domain we started to look into as part of that CRP that I mentioned was in more the healthcare setting. So this was also collaboration with partners at the University of Tasmania here, where they developed a system to automate the oxygen delivery for premature babies. So as you may know, prematurely born babies often have problems with their lungs, because the lung is the last organ that develops in the womb. So if babies are born premature, there's often a problem with, or the lung is still underdeveloped, and so oxygen has to be delivered directly to the baby through different either intubation or other type of breathing apparatus. So what's usually happening, this is a manual process. So a nurse sets thresholds for oxygen saturation, and then there's a sensor measuring oxygen saturation, for example, the finger. And when the baby goes out of the threshold, there's an alarm sounding, and then the nurse has to adjust the oxygen level appropriately based on her experience. Because there's a system delay, there's quite a bit of experience necessary for the nurse. Because if she changes oxygen saturation, the effects only takes effect after a while. So what our partners at the University of Tasmania did, they developed over the years a system that automates that process, where the nurse doesn't have to make the adjustments manually, but the system actually automatically adjusts the oxygen delivery to the premature baby in that case. It was obviously quite limited what we could do, because it was a real world and study that was run. So there was a study so we participated in an already running study. So we could not use physiological sensors in that case, because that would have there was some limitation in terms of we just basically couldn't put sensors on the nurses because that would have potentially limited them in their movements, or also potentially introduce hygiene issues with that. So we just couldn't use any different sensors. So what we did there, we just used questionnaires at each end of each shift. And we also, again, used the same questionnaires that we used in the other studies, so that system trust, scale, and workload. And so the interesting bit was there. So talking to the nurses before we ran the study, they actually said, like, well, look, I I'm sort of skeptic. No, those automated systems can't really replace, the expertise that we've gathered over the years. So a lot of them were quite skeptic about the automation, if it actually could work, and in that case were more untrustworthy of or untrusting of the automated system. But then after them having used it for a while, what we found that, at least in the response that we gathered through those questionnaires, it actually helped to reduce their workload, and also for in terms of trust. What we saw interesting, the trend that they actually, after a while, gave higher scores, with respect to dependability and reliability to the automated system than they did to the manual system. So whereas they were sort of, as I said, sort of quite untrusting at the start of it, after experiencing the system, they had more trust in the automated system than they had in the manual system that they operated themselves, which was quite interesting. So some other work, and sort of some of you may sort of recognize that, sort of Kunal and Pai, sort of you ran that study with us. Or that be you ran it actually. So the idea there was to look at trust in, I call it trust and decision support systems, and I'm going to talk some other examples of that, just to make it sort of a more sort of topical area. So here, the experimental setup was or the task was a shape selection task. So it was a VR-based system where there were different objects distributed in your sort of in a virtual environment. There was a target, and the task was to look for that target in that virtual environment. And manipulated there was the difficulty again. So through the number and the type of targets, the difficulty could be manipulated. There was also a dual task scenario. So in addition to selecting the task, the people also had to solve an n-back task, which produced additional load as well, and also could be used to measure load in that sense. And the other aspect that was manipulated is advice given and the accuracy of the advice. So before starting, in certain conditions, before starting the task, the participants were given instructions where to look for the target. So in that case, there was advice given. So look to your left or look to your right, or your target is to the left or to the right. And the accuracy of that advice was manipulated as well. So in certain conditions, that advice was more accurate. In other conditions, that advice was less accurate. And so again, the different kinds of measures were part of that study. So we used questionnaires, different physiological sensors, EEG, skin response, but also behavioral measures. So just high-level results. So again, the system trust scales had higher trust ratings if the advice was accurate, so what you would expect. In terms of EEG results, so there was some changes in the alpha band. So the power of the alpha band was increased in certain conditions with sort of low cognitive load and high accuracy. And another thing, sort of what I sort of got quite excited about is sort of behavioral measure. So in addition to the questionnaires and the physiological sensors, we also measured, do actually people follow their advice? Because with a head-mount display, or you actually can, well, you can measure head movements. So we measured the head movements there, and with a view on looking at, do the people follow the advice given? So if the virtual advisor tells you look to the left, do people actually start looking to the left or not? So they follow the advice. And there we also found some indication that participants actually did follow the advice more if the advice was accurate. And so I think, personally, I really like those behavioral measures because they give you sort of more, a direct view on, do the people rely on the system? Do the people rely in that case on the on the advice given? And yes, they do in that case. So, and especially if it's accurate. And as you can imagine, if the advice is not accurate, people just give up on that and don't follow that advice. And the other benefit of using behavioral measures is you don't have to use, well, in that case, it's the head-mounted display, but often you don't have to use very complicated apparatus to perform these behavioral measures. So I think there's quite some promise in those. Some other work going back a few years again, also in the topic of decision support systems, we looked at trust in financial advice. So the idea there was, do people trust in automated financial advice? And the application domain was superannuation. I think in New Zealand it's the Kiwi Saver equivalent. So it's more sort of towards the future. If I make sort of additional contributions to my sort of in that case for you would be Kiwi Saver, for us here is superannuation. How does that affect my future savings for retirement? And so banks obviously want to move a lot towards that automated advice because that can scale a lot better than personal advice given by financial advisors. But the question is, do people trust that what we just call it here robo advice? Do people trust that automated advice? So we ran two online surveys. Where the first one was just a pilot survey. We asked people, well, which one do you trust more, humans or automated advice? And unexpectedly, the responses were more in favor of the human advice over automated advice. But if you looked at the demographics here, it was that of those who preferred the robo advice, the majority there were the younger people and those on higher incomes. So there were some subtle demographic differences here. But the more interesting one was the second online survey, where we did sort of what we call an experimental survey, where half of the participants, so 100 people, so we split the 200 people in half, whereas half the people could play around with a advice system, whereas the others had similar advice, but just written advice where they could read. So half of them could experience a advice system, the other one just got the same advice through, in written form. And so what we found there that still most, the overall question taken still most preferred human advice, but what we found that those who had the chance to play around with some of that robo advice system changed their trust rating slightly after having experienced those systems. So whereas first they were more skeptical, after having experienced the system, we're actually more trustworthy of those systems. I think the takeaway home message from this study especially is that a lot of, I guess, trust is built through experience. And this is not surprising to some extent, but often overseen that we talk about trust in systems, how to design systems to build trust and whatnot. But one of the important is people don't build trust just by hearing about the benefits of the system, but actually through experiencing the system. So I think that's one of the very important aspects of that. So some work we just have done recently. We haven't yet analyzed the results, but just to give you sort of a taste of that. Again, in the area of trust in decision support systems, we look at cybersecurity here, and so here is giving people advice on detecting phishing emails or not. And so here we were interested in how does giving more context to advice impact on trust. So again, accuracy, how does accuracy impact trust, but also how does giving more context to the advice given impact trust as well. So here, that context is, so for example, if you give people just the information, this is a phishing email, this is not, or this is a phishing email, because there is a suspicious header, for example, or the email address is suspicious. So the idea was there just to look more into that context. And so, as I said, I can't give you too much results there yet because we still haven't analyzed those results. But so this is just some ongoing work we're doing at the moment. And again, we look at a combination of different measures, again, physiological measures, but also behavioral measures. In that case, it's sort of mouse movements, keyboard patterns, where they would try to analyze to also get sort of a proxy for trust here as well. So we've got 10 minutes left, so I'm just going to step through some, I guess, looking at the problem of trust or from a different angle. So some other ideas that we're having is using completely different data sources to try to get a sort of an idea of public trust in bigger topics. So, and one of these, I have to switch back actually. So, and so the idea of social license to operate. So social license is, well, I can sort of think about it as sort of social acceptance or the trust, social trust of a company, for example. And so what you can see, like a project or a company in that case has social license to operate when it has the ongoing support of the local community. And so, so one project that has been done in that area is just here, for example. There's a different example here, but just so there were some controversial mining operations, or sort of starting in Australia. So the project there looked at how a company that sort of proposed a new mine, for example, what's the social license to operate of that company for creating new mining operations in Australia. And the idea how you can analyze this is just modeling and monitoring this social license to operate through public discourse on Twitter in that case. So what we take tweets about specific hashtags or that involve a specific company and analyze those tweets with a view on does sort of that company, what's the public view of that company? And sort of obviously we work together within our group with people in natural language processing and social media computing that actually can do a lot of that work, sort of analyzing the social discourse. And sort of one thing we do here, for example, is stance analysis. So there's different ways you can look at it. You can do emotional analysis, sentiment analysis. In that case, it's stance. So stance is a user's position towards a topic. And so you can sort of, here the example is, the topic would be climate change. So you set a target, climate change is a real concern, and then you take some input, in that case, a tweet. So the tweet would be, we need to protect our islands to stop destruction of the coral reef. And so then through natural language processing procedures, you then can label that tweet as positive for that case. So that would be, the stance label here would be, this tweet is in favor of the target. So this is some work that we're doing, and we're also thinking about using similar approach to, for example, get an idea about people's trust in new technologies, where you again can use the sort of social discourse on Twitter to get an idea what are people's concerns about and stance towards new technologies, including machine learning, AI technology. So this is some ideas that we're playing around. There's also, this is more now, I guess, a future view into what we're just working on or towards at the moment. So we also have what we call a future science platform. So these are bigger projects across the CSIRO organization. And one of these future science platforms looks at machine learning and AI. And what we're mainly interested here is, again, in this decisions. So how can we look more deeply into the decision making, and how can we develop AI and machine learning algorithms to better help people in decision making? So some examples that we're just exploring here with other people and other partners within the organization is looking, for example, at making decisions for sort of environment and ecology. So for example, managing invasive species. So here the idea would be, or the system that's in development here is looking at giving people, decision makers, information where, for example, to look for this crown of thorns starfish, I think it's called, which is an invasive species that sort of nibbles on the coral reef and destroys the coral reef. And so the system is sort of one of these systems designed to give decision makers information where to look for those starfish, to manage them, basically to kill them off. And what we as a group are interested in to work with the others who develop the system to look at how can we actually communicate the outputs of that system to the people who then are on the ground and have to use the system to make decisions where on the reef to look for those starfish to manage the threat. So just, I guess, to summarize some of the ideas, this is sort of moving, I guess, more towards or seeing automation in a broader sense as well, basic, just not just trust in automation, but more general trust in machine learning AI systems for decision support, which to some extent are in the realm of automation as well. So I guess what I'm very interested in to look at what elements actually do influence users' trust and acceptance of AI and machine learning technologies, automated technologies. I think it's very important there to unpack some of the assumptions. So I always hear different assumptions that explainability will build trust, transparency will build trust. And I think we really have to unpack these and investigate them in more detail if that's really the case, and in what context they're actually really important, in which context they're maybe not. Because explanation's not, I think, not always needed, or sometimes needed differently. So not every user group, not every user needs the same kind of explanation or transparency or interpretability of models. So I think it's really important to look in more detail at the context where a system's used, for which kind of users, and what kind of problems you want to solve. Because I think it really depends on that context to get a better handle on how to design those systems to create more trust in those systems. As I said, sort of unpack sort of terminologies, explainability. I'm actually more in favor of understandability, because explainability doesn't really already mean that you understand the system. So I'm actually more interested in understandability than explainability. Again, how do we communicate results of those systems? And especially how do we do this that people really can build sort of trust in the results and rely on the outputs? And again, coming back to the measurement, and that's sort of an ongoing theme, I guess, throughout the presentation also for me, what I'm especially interested in, how actually can we measure that understandability or especially trust in the system that will give us some evidence and on actually have we achieved the target, because without measurements, we are sort of still tapping in the dark. So how can we design those measures to actually really measure have we achieved what we wanted to achieve with those steps? This is probably, again, sort of another thing we're looking or we want to become part of. So apart from the future science platforms, we also have these missions, which is now a new thing in isCSIRO as well. So bigger societal problems, as we said, large-scale scientific and collaborative research initiatives. You can sort of think about them as sort of moonshot challenges, where you bring together people from different backgrounds, different capabilities to sort of create something bigger. And so we just start looking at, for example, becoming part of that Navigating Climate Change mission, where one of the goals is to communicate impacts of climate change to decision makers, which are, for example, people on the ground, like farmers. So how do we communicate the risks due to climate change on farm operations? And as you may know, just providing system output to a farmer may not help them, because people are usually pretty bad at interpreting risks. So the idea there is, how can you communicate outputs of those models properly, that a person gets the right information out of them to help in their decision, and which then eventually builds trust in that system then as well. So these are some things that we just looking in at the moment. So just coming back, I guess, full circle. Just a quick summary slide of what we talked about. So we talked about, so started with automation, looking at cognitive load, how automation can help reduce cognitive load from a human factors perspective. But we also have to look at other aspects such as trust, because if you don't trust the automated system, it doesn't achieve its target, its goal of reducing cognitive load. And so by looking at sort of these problems in a bigger way, the idea is to eventually improve human system interaction to looking at all these different aspects. And as I said, one of the aspects I became quite interested over the years is sort of especially that aspect of trust. How can we actually use that and measure trust to improve human system interaction? I think I'm sort of on time, I guess.
Yeah, it's exactly 5 now. So yeah, thank you very much for the presentation, Andreas. So I suppose we are open for questions now. So to do this, I think you can just, if you have any questions, you can just raise your hand or a clap on the participant list. Or if you're feeling shy, you could just type it down in the group chat and I'll just read out your questions to Andreas. Well, I suppose, okay, Mark has a question.
Hey, Andreas, I'm sorry I arrived late for your talk. I had another meeting that ran over here, but I was interested in the experiments you talked about, trust and the financial feedback. And do you think it would change if you had a virtual character or some sort of avatar to represent the system? So, for example, here in New Zealand, the company Soul Machine has been building virtual characters that work on the local bank websites. So if you go to the bank website, you can actually speak to the character and ask simple questions like, how do you open a bank account or whatever. And so I'm just curious about how the representation may change the trust in that type of situation.
Look, obviously we haven't looked into that, so it's like, I guess my guess may be as good as yours to some extent. But I think we talked about as part of the other project, that sort of the representation obviously can have sort of potentially an impact on trust. Look, it would be an interesting thing to study further. I think I probably don't have a good answer to it, honestly. Yeah, because I haven't looked at that.
It's interesting. There's several aspects of that. So one is that they carefully chose how their character looks. So the character is represented as a woman, but she's kind of indeterminate race and kind of youngish looking, but could very neutral type of character. And then also the way you interact with the character. So maybe even speaking with the character might change your feeling of trust. And the character has some idle behaviors, like it looks at you and it makes idle conversation while it's waiting for you to build that trust as well.
So did they base the design on some evidence or what?
They've been doing some studies, but I'm not sure. There's a psychologist that works with our lab here in Auckland who's been doing some studies with them, and they've done some studies where people speak to different characters and they measure their physiological response to especially when the character lies to you. So if you say something and the character says something back that's obviously untrue, they've been measuring response in that case. But I think it's still very early days, so I was just curious if you'd...
It certainly sounds interesting.
Especially even in a very simple representation. So, if you obviously don't have a full 3D character, but if you had like a little 2D icon or something that popped up, or a 2D face that popped up when you were doing your financial site. And there's been some examples of websites where you've got chat windows that pop up automatically that are driven by AI that try to put kind of a human face on the interaction.
I'll probably just ping you afterwards.
Oh yeah, drop me an email. I can some.
We do have some ongoing. We do have other groups within the organization that actually look at more the modeling aspect of, I guess, how do contributions and different models, I guess, change your, and so they work with the superannuation industry on their work. So there may be some.
Oh yeah, interesting. Okay, that's great. Thanks.
Great. Any other questions? Maybe I can follow up with a question myself. So yeah, I think trust is a very interesting thing because personally I've also worked a little bit on it, and because it's not exactly an emotion, rather it's a psychophysiological state. So my question is, Andreas, what do you think actually is the key difference for trust towards humans and trust towards machines? Like for example, let's say we use the automated vehicle example. If we have taxis in the future where there are no drivers, as opposed to taxi drivers right now, which we trust them to send us to our destination, even though we do not actually know them personally. So in this regard, what do you think is the difference in this trust between an actual human driver as opposed to an AI driver?
Okay, and I think that sort of starts to get very philosophical pretty quickly. So we had a few weeks ago a sort of an internal conference as part of that future science platform on AI ML, and so the question was sort of more on I guess more ethical questions. And so there was a panel that had sort of on purpose of the pros and cons, and also some people took the pro and some people took the con position. And one proposition was like, well, is it ethical to not trust systems? Because well, automated systems are more reliable, often more reliable than humans. So why should we actually rely on humans, not on automated systems in the first place? But it's and then you can sort of pick that apart. And obviously, oftentimes automated systems maybe even there may be evidence that they're more reliable. But then I think there's always sort of a human thing somewhere in the background with like, well, but no,
right? Yeah.
What if? Yes. So. Look, I don't have a good answer to that, because I'm not
opinion.
I'm aware, and some of the ethical concerns and also obviously influence sort of the stuff that we do, and we work together sort of in other parts of the organization that more look at the philosophical aspects of it. It's not one of my strengths to some extent, the philosophical musings about sort of trust, I guess, where. Yeah, but oftentimes I do agree that technology is often put under more scrutiny than people. Especially for the autonomous driving situation. There's people arguing if everything was automated, we have less accidents. So yeah.
Yeah, I suppose if there's an accident by a human driver, we can easily point fingers to the human driver. But if it's an AI, then it's hard to point fingers. So we probably need some kind of new laws for that. Because as humans, we need to point fingers to someone.
And there's plenty of research exactly on that. Sort of who do you attribute the fault to? And how do you design a system to what should it do? And I just can remember some interesting aspects there for some studies that actually looked at. So if a system had to decide between, they sort of the binary decision, killing somebody else or the driver, what should the system do if there's unavoidable? So people's like, well, yeah, no, maybe, it the driver should suffer because he sits in the car rather than the person out there. But then if they ask, would you buy such a system? Say, well, no, I wouldn't. So yeah, honestly, it's probably a long discussion to be had.
Right. Is there any questions from anyone else? It's interesting that you mentioned about ethics, because I also have a follow-up question to that. So I think maybe the end goal of your project would be you have maybe established a way to actually objectively measure trust. So let's say you've managed to develop a system that could tell if someone is trusting it by a measure of 0 to 100%. Ideally, you managed to do this great system. What do you think are the ethical concerns, especially if Facebook or something gets their hands on a system like this that knows exactly how much you trust it, and then you might exploit it to get maybe more personal information from you because it knows that you are fully trusting of it, or if it knows that you're not trusting of it, then it'll try to adjust its parameters to get you to trust it more. Maybe it's another philosophical question, I don't know, but what do you think about it?
Look, I'm not a philosopher, but no, it's obviously with any with any type of research that you do, you have to take into account the best intentions of what you do and how it's going to be used, but eventually it's out of your control how somebody further down the line will actually
use it. Yeah.
And maybe not a satisfactory answer to that. To some extent, I can do the best I can do, not just to not pursue those.
Yeah, I suppose you will leave it to the hands of those philosophers.
For me, look, obviously, well, essentially, well, not anything, but many things that you do, you can't really control how somebody will use it. For me, as I said, I'm more interested in. Just want to ask, for example, this calibration of trust, where I think that's how these things can be used in a positive manner. In a way, it's like, well, you actually want to alert people to not over-trust the system or under-trust the system, not just actually trust in a way that it's calibrate your trust on the trustworthiness to some extent of the system. If that makes sense.
Yeah, so a balanced level of trust, not too much, not too little.
I'll probably share some. I have it on my last slide. There's actually some really good sort of a TED talk by a British philosopher on trust, and it's just some aspects that really relate, I guess, also to discussions about sort of trust and automation. He talks about trust more in a more general way. I actually came across her last year in a different project where we looked at trust and data sharing, and she talks more about she starts with the notion that people think there's a lack of trust, in the political system and otherwise. And she actually says, well, it's actually not that simple. And she actually does sort of unpack that a bit. It's like, well, there's actually not a lack of trust. There's no evidence for more lack of trust now than there used to be. Anyhow, so we'll go too long. I can actually, if you're interested, I can share that with you. So I think it's a really interesting piece of the short TED talk on some of the thinking that she has on trust and trustworthiness. It answers some questions better than I can do. A lot of things.
Right.
Yeah.
Yes. So is there anybody else with a question? Nobody? Maybe I'll just bombard you with one more question.
Today.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, there's so many people. Well,
I had one more question.
Okay.
Andreas, you've done a bit of experiments with a variety of physiological sensors. So, in terms of the kind of minimum physiological sensor that would be good for measuring trust, what would you recommend? So, for example, if a person had an Apple Watch that could measure heart rate and motion or something like that, would that provide enough cues to give you another channel for measuring trust as well?
So we haven't looked, as we sort of earlier. So we looked, for example, at the skin response as sort of a small. So I don't have experience too much yet with heart rate, if that sort of also can be used as a proxy for trust. So for us, I guess the minimum that we looked into in that case was the skin response. But there may be, would be potentially interesting to look into heart rate. So I can't comment on it because we haven't looked into it. The other thing, I guess, to take into account, as you know as well, what's the accuracy of those systems? So I'm not experienced with an Apple Watch, how accurate the sensor data is that you get out of it, but
right.
measure is obviously limited by the accuracy of the sensor in the first place as well. So it really, I guess, depends on. I don't have experience, obviously, with the Apple Watch, but no.
That's okay. So you're saying you have some GSR. So you had a band that provided GSR. That would be enough for some experiments.
Well, we have some indication. I don't think there's certainly more work that can be done on sort of the signal processing side of things. So as sort of with one of the studies, we found sort of roughly around sort of 80% accuracy of classifying trust. I would assume that this could be improved potentially with, but again, it's probably an interplay between accuracy of the sensor, the actual task that you do. And also, I think the other thing is we looked at not real-time measurement in that case, but as after the fact. So, as you sort of mostly doing those studies. So, another really interesting aspect could actually be to actually look into the more real-time classification. So during task performance. And so, yeah, we haven't looked into that yet.
Okay, so it's like an interesting area for future research. And I can imagine also in VR. So I've had a conversation with somebody that said the new version of the Hewlett-Packard head-mount display that's coming out, not this year but next year, will probably include some EMG sensors or heart rate sensors in the display itself. So you can imagine people that will provide an avenue for those VR experiences to provide richer emotional and trust feedback.
So I guess from if you can extract from the skin response, it's basically a crude measure of your nervous, of your autonomous nervous system, I guess. So from that, to some extent, I would assume to some extent any other physiological measure that also measures the similar activation of the nervous system could potentially be used for that purpose. But as we've seen, sort of in some of the other studies, I think the challenge there is just to find the right measure even within that signal, because the signal is sometimes noisy. And what we found, for example, the time domain may actually give you different information than the frequency domain, and so I think there's certainly a lot of exploration that needs to be done to get to really reliable.
Okay, that's good. Thank you for that.
Okay, so if there are no more questions, I suppose this brings us to the end of today's seminar series. Thank you very much again to Andreas for sharing your research with us, and also thank you very much to the attendees for joining.